Continue our study in the book of Genesis called Beginnings. While you're looking up Genesis, we're picking up in chapter 10 and 11. While you're looking that up, just to mention that last Sunday night we had a wonderful time in our expressions of worship. It was well attended, good group here, and I just enjoyed it. Some of the things that I got to hear were just wonderful. It was last week, right? Yeah. It seems like it was 2 weeks ago, but I'm quite sure it was last week. But it was such an enjoyable time. And for those of you who came, I know that you enjoyed it. Many of you have told me you did. We'll probably do it again because it was so much. So, I mean, the expressions of worship, the variety that you hear, the different expressions is just wonderful. And I enjoyed it all.
Amen.
All right. Last week we focused in on Noah and his family after the flood. So they've gotten off the ark, it's after the flood, and the thing that we saw was that the problem of sin still there. Because in their own family, right then, there was sin. Now today we move further out from the flood. As we're moving out beyond their family in chapter 9. In chapter 10, what we're going to see is the nations that arise from Noah's sons, Japheth, Ham, and Shem. In fact, chapter 10 is often called the Table of Nations because there are some 70 nations that arise from those boys. So what we would see there to begin with is that Israel becomes informed as they hear this. Here's where all these nations came from. Also, as we move into chapter 11, we're going to look at the first 9 verses of chapter 11. We see how languages and how the spreading out of people came to be. Why aren't people living in one place? Well, they've kind of spread out, and there's different languages. So my sermon title today is The Beginning. It's Beginnings, right? That's the series. The Beginning of Nations and Languages, as we see that taking place. Now, while today's passage is from Genesis 10:1 through 11:9, we're not going to read all of that together. We're going to pick up in chapter 11, verse 1. I will refer back to chapter 10, but we're going to read chapter 11, verses 1 to 9. So if you're able, please stand in honor of God's word and reverence for it as we read this morning, beginning in chapter 11, verse 1. It says there, "Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, 'Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly.' And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, 'Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. And let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth.' And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of man had built. And the Lord said, 'Behold, they are one people, and they have all one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. And nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down, and there confuse their language, so that they may not understand one another's speech.' So the Lord dispersed them from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth. And from there the Lord dispersed them over the face of the earth." May God bless the reading of His word this morning. As you're seated, most of us are no doubt very familiar with this passage. And there's always a danger when we're really familiar with a passage, because we can think we know all there is to know about that passage. And yet there's always something new in God's word as we study it and as we look at it. And this goes beyond telling us about a tower and how people came to speak in different languages. Now, coming out of chapter 10, or especially chapter 9, that's a valid question, isn't it? Where did all these languages come from? You come to chapter 10, you have all these languages, because Noah and his family obviously only had one language. They could talk to one another. They could understand each other, and yet chapter 10 alludes to many languages. So it's not that the writer doesn't know about different languages. He knows they're there, even though he hasn't explained it yet. In verse 5 of chapter 10 of Japheth's line, it says, "From these the coastland people spread in their lands, each with his own language, by their clans and in their nations." In verse 20 of Ham's line, These are the sons of Ham by their clans, their languages, their lands, and their nations. In verse 31 of Shem's line, the same thing. These are the sons of Shem by their clans, their languages, their lands, and their nations. So how did humans, after the flood, become separated and have different languages? The Bible account does answer that important question. They would have wanted to know that. In fact, verse 25 of chapter 10 hints that the answer may be coming, because there it says, to Eber were born two sons. The name of the one was Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided. Now Peleg, the word Peleg means division. So there's a hint here that there's, division happened. It happened somewhere, and maybe we're going to find out where. And we do indeed find out where. Now that's not the only importance of the Babel account, because relating how multiple languages began isn't the whole story. What we see here is also some insight into why God does it. Why different languages? Because you may know that, but you don't know why. And we'll see that what happens at Babel is important because it makes way for God's kingdom on earth as God intended it. And it's actually for humankind's benefit. We look at it as a judgment, but it's really for humankind's benefit that it takes place. So there are two acts here to the Babel account. Act 1 is verses 1 to 4. All human activity. That's all we see. There's human activity. God is completely absent from the first 4 verses. And then verses 5 to 9 is all God's activity. And while mankind is still present, it's God who's acting there. So we begin in verse 1 with all people united. Everyone speaks one language. They have a common vocabulary. They can understand each other. It's a nice thing. If we all spoke different languages here, it would be difficult for us to have this service, wouldn't it? But we can have a service in one language. We understand one another. Now they settled together in the fertile plain in Shinar. Where exactly that is isn't clear to us. Many believe that it's the area of Mesopotamia, the region of Babylonia, ancient Babylon, in other words, and that's certainly a viable possibility. But others argue for a more northern location. It really doesn't matter. Everyone's together in one place on a plain with one language. That's how we start out. Now, when we get to verse 3, we see an apparent innovation. This is a good thing. Because there we have kiln-baked bricks rather than stone. Now, how many of you know what a kiln-baked brick is? Some of you said, I'm not sure. Maybe I do. What is this building made from? What? Kiln-baked bricks. My understanding is that was done right out here. Right? Kiln-baked bricks right out here. This building is constructed with kiln-baked bricks. But here is no doubt an innovation. Something new. They weren't using stone. They were using bricks. They used bitumen rather than mortar. Now we use mortar. Bitumen is like a kind of a pitch, mineral pitch, tar-like, asphalt-like substance. And they had pits in the area from which they could get that, so they used it. But what we have here is an example of human creativity. You know, we're created in God's image, and He has made us as creative beings. Our God's a creative God, and He's made us creative as well. And it's a good thing when we use our creativity in ways that honor Him. So there's nothing wrong with making bricks in this way. It's a blessing. But, like any blessing, it can become a source of pride in us. Anything we're good at, we can get proud of. Anything we achieve can become a source of pride. So that's a danger we might see here. And then when we come to verse 4, we see their plan. Chapter 11, verse 4 says, Then they said, Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. And let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth. So the first thing they want to do is build a city. Now, not necessarily a bad thing, but it might remind us of Cain, who built a city in chapter 4, verse 17. We already studied that. And Cain's not our role model, is he? So maybe there'd be a mild caution there, not necessarily a strong caution. But the second thing they want to do is to have a tower in the city. You know, I was reading this, which I usually read many times over when I'm studying for a sermon, but I got to thinking about my granddaughter. You know my granddaughter Lydia, the cutest thing on earth. There's really nothing cuter than that little girl. Maybe the little boy, Evan, is close. He's working his way up. But when she started playing with blocks, she liked to see towers, right? Build towers. She liked to build towers. She liked us to build towers for her, too. But it's one of the easier things to do. You just put one block on top of another, and you keep doing that. And so she would learn to build towers. And then, of course, knock them down. Right? But she had a fascination with towers. And I think that fascination doesn't go away when you grow up, because as you get older, aren't we fascinated by tall, impressive things? A tall, impressive tree is something that catches our attention. Big buildings, tall buildings, you look at them and you're astounded by it. Well, here, they want a tower. Not just any tower, but an impressively tall tower sitting on a plain where it would be easy to see from all around. It would be impressive, with its top in the heavens. Now, that's the first hint. There might be something wrong, perhaps, here, right? The celestial dwelling place of the gods, often viewed by pagan people that way. So maybe a path to God. In fact, most experts, theologians, and others believe this was probably a ziggurat. A ziggurat is simply a pyramid-shaped structure, much like the pyramids in Egypt, except it would have had a stairway up one side of it. At the top of the ziggurat would be a building. In that building would be a place, a table for deity to sit at and have something to eat. There'd be a bed for deity to take a nap, I guess. Would be the purpose for a bed. And at the bottom there would be a temple, and they would be hoping that the deity would use those stairs. They provided beautiful access for them to come to the temple and accept their worship and their gifts that they would give to the deity. A very humanized view of God. A God that has needs, a God that has to eat, a God that has to sleep. I'm glad our God isn't that kind of God. But that's the kind of God that would point to. Important cities in Babylonia each had a ziggurat. In fact, in Babylonian literature, Babylon is connected with a word that means the gate of God. They viewed their ziggurats and they viewed themselves, really, their society as the gate to God. A source of great pride and arrogance to them. But there's a major problem here. They have blurred the distinction between God and mankind. There's a big difference between God and mankind, but they've blurred that distinction here, which essentially created a false God, a false view of God, a God who isn't the God who really is. Verse 4 also, though, reveals their motives, some of their motivations. The first motivation it gives us is to make a name for themselves, to establish their own greatness. They wanted to be autonomous. They were looking to be independent of God. Now, what does that remind me of? It reminds me actually of Adam and Eve in the garden. It reminds me of more than that, but it certainly reminds me of Adam and Eve in the garden. What did they want? Satan said, "You will be like God if you eat this fruit, having knowledge of good and evil." They were seeking autonomy, that they wouldn't need God to tell them good and evil. They would know it. So they were seeking something that God had chosen not to give to them. Gordon Wenham, who's a theologian, says it is God alone who makes a name for himself. Mankind is again attempting to usurp divine prerogatives. It's God's purpose and his prerogative to name people, things, to make a name for himself. Now, the honest truth is God at times made a name for people. We see that in the Old Testament. We see in Genesis 12:2, just the next chapter over, he says to Abram, "I will bless you and make your name great." God will do that. We see that with King David. With David in 2 Samuel 7:9, "And I will make for you a great name." God making a great name for David. God gives Jesus the name that is above every name in Philippians 2:9. You see, it's God's prerogative to make a name for himself. It's God's prerogative to make a name for other people. It's not our prerogative to go out to make a name for ourselves. It wasn't their prerogative to do that either. Well, second motivation, other than that, is to avoid being dispersed over the face of the whole earth. Mankind desired unity. What's wrong with that? Isn't that a good thing? to desire unity. We want to be united in our faith, certainly. What's wrong with mankind being united? It reminds me of the word peace, doesn't it? You'd think that would be a good thing. But here's the thing. God's intent was precisely that humankind spread throughout the earth. That's what he wanted to happen. In Genesis 1:28, he told Adam, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it. In Genesis 9:1, God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. There's this idea of filling the earth. Now, there may be then a note of defiance in this. There may be. I'm not going to say there absolutely is, but there seems like there might be. They seek to chart their own destiny apart from God instead of doing what God wants. The city and tower certainly represent independence and security to them, regardless of anything else. So by working together, what they're really seeking to do is to render God unnecessary. They don't need God. Well, how will God respond to that? Well, we move into Act 2, God's activity. Verse 5 tells us that the Lord comes down to see the city and tower. I have to laugh when I read that. The Lord came down to see the tower that they built up to heaven. The heavens. The Lord came down just to see it. He knew it was there. He knew what they were doing, but he had to come down to see it. You know, he's not impressed. That tower did not impress God one little bit when he saw it. But there is a problem here. Look at verse 6. And the Lord said, behold, they are one people, and they have all one language. And this is only the beginning of what they will do. And nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. So what's going on here? Is the Lord afraid of the ability of a unified mankind? That somehow maybe they'll usurp his position as God? Well, that doesn't make any sense, does it? Right away, you have to dismiss that out of hand. But it does remind us a little bit of Genesis 3:22, where this is God speaking. Then the Lord God said, behold, the man has become like one of us in knowing good and evil. Now lest he reach out his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat and live forever. And then God kicks them out of the garden. Why is he doing it? He doesn't want them confirmed in their sin. They've eaten from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. They've fallen into sin. He doesn't want them confirmed and live forever in that state. So he kicks them out of the garden. So his issue there is that he doesn't want them to live forever in that sinful state. It's for their good. Now after the flood, and I've mentioned this verse a couple of times, I think it's so key, Genesis 8:21, and when the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma, this is when Noah has gotten off the ark and he's offering up his offering to God. The Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of man, for this is what I wanted to get to. The intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. It points to the innate sinfulness of humankind since the fall. It started with Adam and Eve, but it's continued even after the flood. It's still there. And God's concern is that a unified humankind will become irrevocably sinful. The depth of sin that they can go to, the wickedness will continue to grow. There's nothing to limit it. They're going to work together to be sinful and to be wicked. And that's a problem for his kingdom. And he's already determined not to wipe everyone out again. He can't go back and have another flood. He said, no, I'm not going to do that. So how's he going to limit this? Well, he takes action. That's what he's doing. He's taking action to limit the wickedness. Look at verse 7. Come, let us go down and there confuse their language so that they may not understand one another's speech. And then verse 8 is dispersed. So come, let us. You know, up to now, that's been what mankind's been saying. Come, let us. Verse 3. And they said to one another, come, let us make bricks and continues from there. In verse 4, they said, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower. And let us make a name for ourselves. Let us, let us, let us. Now God's saying, which one carries more authority, do you suppose? When God says, let us, it is us. Who's us? A heavenly visitation. The Trinity, perhaps? I tend to lean that way, but it could also be an angelic group of his servants joining in with God to do that. He could be using his own angelic servants. It doesn't matter. It's a heavenly group, God and whoever else he wanted to use to do it. They come down and they scatter everyone by taking their language and changing it. So now, if we were all here and our language changed, we couldn't understand. You'd be listening to me and saying, what on earth is he saying? You may be thinking that anyway. But you would certainly be thinking that if I was speaking some other language, unless you knew that language. So they scatter, which guess what they didn't want to do? They didn't want to scatter. They didn't want to spread throughout the earth. They wanted to be in one place and make a name for themselves. So we're told they quit building the city. Interestingly to me, is the name of the city is explained. It wouldn't have to be, but it is. Because I think about that lofty Babylonian idea of being the gate to God. But Babel, with this tower, isn't the gate to God. Instead, it's tied to the Hebrew word that means confused. Because there God confused their language. Of course, we think of babbling when we hear that name. Spelled differently, but that's what we think about. But they had confused languages, and so that was the name of their city. That they left, by the way. Now earlier, the Tower of Babel pictures rebellion against God. That's the picture of the Tower of Babel. Sometimes we may argue about what things the most onerous that they did, but it was rebellion against God. It was a symbol of human autonomy and pride. That's what Babel was. But God easily brought them down. He didn't destroy the city. All he did was confuse their language. Now Israel, as they first heard this, would see in this account that secular cities and false humanized gods were no match for their sovereign Lord. We see that over and over again in Scripture. God showing himself to be powerful. And that would be encouragement for them to live in obedience to the Lord. So that they were his people, having his benefits of him working in their midst for their favor. It would also be encouragement to face the Canaanite strongholds. As they leave the desert wilderness and they go into Canaan, they would now be encouraged to face those strongholds, knowing their God can handle that. He can handle anything. It would be encouragement during their time of that captivity in Babylon later on. Babylon was the pride of the East. It was militarily strong, a cosmopolitan center, had a huge ziggurat. You're going to know that word. A huge ziggurat. Arrogant rebels against God is who they were. But God could deal with Babylon as they were in captivity there. In fact, Israel might even see their own situation in Babylon as a result of their own pride and disobedience. God took care of them and dispersed them where they didn't want to be. Took them out of their land and took them to another land as they embraced other so-called gods. They did that while still claiming to be God's people. We can make claims. Claims don't always mean anything if we're following our own idols. It occurred to me as I was studying this that the hubris of mankind at Babel is little different than that found today. I don't think ever in my lifetime have I seen in American culture so much antipathy towards God. A growing antipathy towards God. Our culture largely declares themselves to be autonomous. God is considered the crutch needed by the weak. That's what God is. We don't need or want God. We'll do as we please. Thank you very much. A lot of pride there, isn't there? I heard someone say this week that the question isn't whether or not we need God, it's whether or not God exists. That's the real question, because if he doesn't exist, then we can safely forget about him. He doesn't matter. But if he does, then to forget about him is delusional. Much of the world is deluded this morning. It's unwise in the extreme to decide based on what we want, because the facts are the facts whether we want them to be or not. And usually when we say there is no God, or we want to live as though there is no God, it's because we don't want there to be a God. We don't want anyone telling us what to do. We want to be autonomous. We want to make our own decisions about everything. Sometimes even we Christians are guilty of antipathy towards God's commands. Let me give you a couple examples. There are many. Here's a couple. We think there are times we don't have to forgive. That's too terrible what they did. I'm not going to forgive them. You don't have to forgive. The Bible says, Jesus says, we should forgive our enemies, love our enemies, forgive them. Jesus forgave those who nailed him to a cross as they were crucifying him. He forgave them. We just prayed a little while ago, forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. Now, that may be an unfortunate word for us at this point in time. We don't understand what that means sometimes. We're not saying somebody owes you some money. It has nothing to do with that. What this is talking about is sin. Forgive me for my sins, as I forgive those who sin against me. Another example, we think we know better when it comes to premarital relations. The Bible's not ambiguous about it. But we think we know better. The Bible's clear. The marriage bed is to be undefiled. Why would we think differently? Why would we live differently? Well, the answer to that's pretty simple. We're honoring God with our lips, but our hearts are centered on ourselves. That's the difference. That's what's going on. Our hearts are far from Him. Individual pride, marked by picking and choosing what of God's word we are willing to submit to, is a dangerous game. Because God exalts the humble and brings down the proud. And believe me, having faith in God means trusting that what God wants for us is the best. That's part of it. What He says is what's best for us. Just like scattering the people at Babel was really what was best for them. And that's the thing that stands out most to me in this Babel account. That once again, God is acting out of concern for His creatures. Isn't that neat? He keeps doing it. They're blindly hurtling towards disaster, and He acts to put the brakes on. He pulls that brake in the train. You know that you see when everybody falls down, you pull the brake, and everyone goes down. He's pulling the brake and saying, slow down. Let's slow down this wickedness. He's not giving up on His earthly kingdom at all. So what looks like judgment, once again, is really God's grace. We have a gracious God. From those dispersed nations will come Abraham. From him, the nation of Israel will come. The pathway through David, eventually to King Jesus, comes through that pathway. And only in Jesus is God's kingdom fully restored. Because only in Him can we have the relationship with God that we're intended to have. Because He's reconciled us to God by His blood, paying the penalty for our sins on the cross. And that's grace. You know, in Revelation chapter 17 and 18, Babylon there symbolizes mankind's desire to dethrone God. Mankind seeks to make earth their kingdom, and God is not recognized as king. You've read Revelation, I hope, at least some of you. It's God's kingdom. God created the world. The world is His. How foolish to reject His loving reign over His kingdom. We accept His reign through faith in Jesus, receiving Him as our Savior and Lord, as our King. over our lives. And in the end, whether we like it or not, whether we recognize God as Jesus as Lord or not, he is King and he will reign. That's what's going to happen. And I hope you're part of that kingdom, because he's welcoming people into his kingdom. This morning, he's welcoming people until the time he comes again. What a day that will be. That's a song we could sing, isn't it? The day that will be when my Jesus I shall see. I'm looking forward to that. I hope you are too. Let's pray. Father,